David Nather of Congressional Quarterly writes that more than any other piece of the Bush education overhaul plan, the testing proposal is being pummeled from all sides. Suburban parents say their children are already being tested enough. In Scarsdale, New York, for example, some parents have threatened to boycott the state science tests by keeping their 8th graders home on exam day. Urban parents have a different concern. They say their children are not getting the help they need to pass the tests. Jeanne Allen of the Center for Education Reform is testing a good idea.
It's an excellent idea. In fact, what we need to do is, in order for kids to learn, we need to know what they're being taught. And one of the ways you figure out what children are being taught, how well they're doing, is you measure. In every other field in America, we use measurement as a gauge to figure out what we do, what we're doing wrong, what we're doing right, what we need to do more of. And, you know, there's a lot of misinformation about what testing does, but the bottom line is parents really do want the information that says, here's the snapshot of your child, here's how they're doing in reading, here's how they're doing in writing, and here's what we need to do more of. So testing gives us that snapshot, and testing helps us hold the people and the institutions around our children accountable so they do what they need to do all the time.
Paul Houston, American Association of School Administrators. Do you agree with that?
Generally, I agree with that. I think that there's always assessment, and I would rather talk about assessment than testing, because I think assessment is really finding out, it's really dealing with some of the stuff that Jeannie's talking about. We do need to know generally how well kids are doing on an ongoing basis. You need to be able to do diagnosis of kids to see what their weaknesses are and strengths are. Parents should be informed on a regular basis how things are working, and we need to hold schools accountable. Our concern, I think, is more a matter about the quality and the quantity of the testing that's being done and being proposed.
According to the Bush plan, currently, which begins debate tomorrow in the Senate, students would be tested in reading and math annually in grades 3 through 8, and states would choose the tests that were used. The following steps would be used to improve schools that did not meet adequate yearly progress standards. Year 1, technical assistance would be available to improve the school. Year 2, parents could send their child to a better performing public school, but federal funds could not be used for transportation. Year 3, federal funds could be used for private tutoring services or for transportation to another public school. Year 4, the school would be reopened under a different structure or new faculty. Do you agree with that accountability proposal?
Well, we agree with accountability in general. I think that that particular proposal may be ramping things up too fast. If you look at where we are right now in most states, that's really asking them to move very quickly. I mean, if you look at Mr. Bush's home state of Texas, which is trumpeted as one of the models for all this, they've been at it now for 12, 14 years of ramping up their expectations and working that system forward, raising the standards each year, raising the bar each year, implementing more of the program. What you're really now doing is saying what took 12 or 14 years in one state to do, we're going to do nationally in 3 years. And I think I question whether it can be done that fast. I don't necessarily question the overall intent of raising accountability standards and raising the overall quality of what we're doing. I think we all can agree on that one. It's a question of really practicality at this point.
We can't afford to wait, Peter. Quite frankly, we have 30% of our fourth graders in America are proficient in reading, only 30%. Only a little more than 33% know their math well at a fourth grade level. It gets worse as you go higher up the system. We can do it now. We want to do it now. Americans are very supportive of this idea. It's a matter of the will, and it's quite frankly a matter of getting the right tools in front of us and instituting the right consequences. In Virginia, some of the same arguments, and Paul and I disagree on this, but I understand where he's coming from. Some of the same arguments were made in Virginia when Virginia instituted standards of learning, which are considered some of the best standards in the country. They created a test with lots of teeth that said, in a couple of years, you folks are going to be held accountable for how you do on the test, and the schools are going to be accredited based on the performance of those tests. And everyone said, oh my gosh, we can't do that. How can we get there? And the first year was a little messy. And the second year, all of a sudden achievements started going up. In the third year, children, because they're being tested and they know it counts, are doing better. All the schools, all the teachers are hunkering down and getting to business and realizing that we've been doing a lot of frou-frou stuff for a long time, that we really do have to focus on academics, and we work together and focus, and when there's a consequence, people behave in very different ways than when it's just okay to keep going day after day.
You were quoted in the Washington Times today, Jeanne Allen, saying that the Bush administration plan may not survive the onslaught by the National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers. Do they disagree with the testing provisions?
They do. They believe that fundamentally they should leave this as a local matter, that it should take more time. I think they're more in line with what Paul and the American Association of School Administrators is saying. And again, it's a fundamental disagreement about where we should shift our attention and how quickly we can get our schools and our people around our children held accountable.
Waterbury, Connecticut is first up for Jeanne Allen and Paul Houston. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much to CNN. I listen to your program every day and enjoy it. My comment is this. I think that you can give all the money you want to education, but until more authority is given to the teachers and the principals, and the parents take a more active role in the educational system, that you're not going to get anywhere. And I think that you should confine your teaching to math, to history, and et cetera, the major programs in a school.
Paul Houston.
Well, I guess probably Jeanne and I wouldn't totally disagree on that one at all. I mean, I think we do think that education, one of the things that I find most interesting about the business I'm in is it's so complex, and there's so many issues involved. And very clearly, everyone has to have a part in the action, and everyone has to be involved in the process. And schools have been asked to do so much historically over the particularly last 30, 40 years, and to fill in the gaps for a lot of other parts of our society that perhaps aren't doing, for a variety of reasons, aren't doing as much as they used to do. And so we've really loaded onto the schools a great deal. And that's really one of the issues, I think, with one of our concerns about the testing. Not that I basically don't disagree with Jeanne's basic premises that we need to move forward, we need to move forward as rapidly as we can, and what have you. But we're dealing with a situation out there where the schools are still having to do all these other things, trying to figure out how to fit the testing in. The testing program, for example, we estimate it's about 20 days a year that's going to be involved in this. That's a lot of time taken from instruction simply to do the testing in and of itself. And I think we would rather see the testing done more periodically, less every year, every kid, every year situation. So it's more a matter of degree and volume than it is everything else to deal with some of these other issues that the callers discussing.
When you were superintendent of schools in Riverside, California, Tucson, Arizona, or Princeton, New Jersey, was there annual tests?
We did do regular testing for different reasons, and so at one grade level we might test for maybe we did periodic testing, let's say third grade, fifth grade, eighth grade, to check for the accountability purposes that we've discussed already. But we also tested at other grades for diagnostics, so we could give really in-depth feedback to teachers so that they could use the information. Because one of the keys with testing is not just the single score you get from the test. The real value of testing is what do you learn about what the kid knows and doesn't know, and can you give that feedback to schools and to teachers so it's used and built into their program. The other issue, and this is a point that Jeanne made earlier, we may disagree on the quality of what Virginia did with their standards of learning, but to give Virginia at least credit, they're trying to align their assessment against standards. So many of our states have not aligned their assessment against their standards. So if you're going to test kids and you're not testing against the standards that you want them to learn, then the tests themselves end up being the goal, and you end up teaching to the test, and that's not a very healthy activity or helpful. So that's one of the issues I think that has to be sorted out in this process. And we're saying to the Bush administration, to those promoting H.R. 1, put more, put some of the same teeth into the testing stuff you're putting into the other things in the program.
I want to give an example of where kind of the rubber meets the road on testing. You take an example like Jersey City, New Jersey, which is a district that is so in disrepair it's been taken over by the state for years. And there's just very little learning going on. Well, we come to find out a couple of years ago that kids were not being tested there on a statewide measure until 4th grade. So between, say, pre-K or kindergarten and 4th grade, we weren't finding out for 5 years that children are below 10% in terms of knowing reading, that they were so at the bottom of the barrel that by 4th grade, if you don't know how to read and do basic math and know basic writing skills, you're lost. And so part of the reason behind the annual testing and pushing the states to do it is the administration is saying, look, and I think this is a very same thing that we've endorsed for a long time before the Bush administration came to Washington, look, you want federal money, you want support of the American taxpayer, you have to be willing to show year after year with measurements that you know how to spend that money, that you in fact are using that money on what it was intended for, what the American people think it's intended for, which is learning. So show us the results. Let's be, the caller from Waterbury, Connecticut makes a very good point about flexibility. It's very critical, Peter, to have the flexibility at the school level to do what's best. But we have to be firm on the outcome, what we want, the standard, and then we have to let the schools have it be up to them, as long as they're accountable, how to reach those goals. But we can't say that you open your doors every year, regardless of how well you do. We have to be willing to say, you're not doing well, you need to move over.
Flint, Michigan, Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a very extensive background. I was an educator. I left education. I owned businesses. I got into many school districts. I walked through the schools. I have not seen one school where the teachers were not dedicated to the pursuit of educating their children. I've seen various situations in schools. Ceilings falling in. Right now, there's a high school in Flint, Michigan that's closed because the ceiling fell in. Now, what concerns me, I've seen these many, many different reforms. The reforms never address the real issue. The real issue is that people are there wanting to do their job, but they don't get the support of government. I've seen in the last 20 years that with the change to block grants are what destroyed federal support of education.
Do you agree with that?
No, I don't agree at all. Respectfully disagree. We have to understand that there is such an amazing support mechanism for what people are doing in schools today. It's unbelievable. Money is a huge issue. It always will be. You can't educate kids without money. However, money has to follow good programs, and you can't let people just do anything without some sort of standard. So you got to look at it a completely different way. You have to say, yes, absolutely, teachers are dedicated. They wouldn't be in the classroom if they weren't there, and they need our respect and our support. But at the same time, we have to realize that not all teachers who are teaching math know how to teach math, and not all teachers who are in front of the class teaching reading have the right, clear standard about what their kids should know at first, second, and third grade. So we have to give them some guidelines. We have to make sure that there are standards in place, and we have to give them the tools to succeed. But that means that the principal, the superintendent, the school board, and the teacher have to be willing to say, I, in fact, have a role to play in educating this child, and if I'm not having an impact on that child, I need to be held accountable. And so it's not a matter of lack of support, it's a matter of shifting what we're doing in a different way and giving parents more options, giving teachers more options and a more say in the classroom, and saying to them, you're on a performance contract, and if you can succeed, show us. And I think when we do that, we've seen success over and over and over again. If we raise expectations, we give people the tools to get there, but we're very, very strict what the results are, and if short time frame, so we don't lose more kids, they will rise to that expectation.
Paul Houston, in the president's education budget proposal, he has taken away a lot of the line items and turned it into a block grant. Do you agree with the block grant approach?
Well, in general, my organization is supportive of more flexibility, giving local districts, local school boards, superintendents, principals, teachers, more flexibility to use the federal money that comes to them. I think that the caller's point about block grants has merit, and it's a little bit of a tricky issue because in some cases where there's been block granting, it's been block and cut. So you put all the programs into one pot, and then you reduce that pot over time because there's no constituency to support that particular pot of money. But I think the idea of flexibility, of making things more flexible, allowing more flexibility at local levels, absolutely. And I agree with Jeanne in terms of the standards issue. I think that reasonable standards need to be set, And there's an interplay between setting those standards and goals and then giving people the flexibility to meet those depending on the local situation. And again, my concern with the assessment is if it did all the things that Jeannie's saying it could do, I would agree with her. My just question is that the assessment that's being proposed, assessment system being proposed, is not going to deliver some of those good things that I think she and I would both agree needs to take place in schools, because there's a lack of precision, that there's a lack of match between the testing and what's being taught, that sort of thing. So it's not a matter of testing or no testing. It's a matter of aligning it in a way that delivers the kinds of issues that we're both, I think, saying need to happen.
But Peter, can I define block grant?
Let me get
Okay,
Denver in
go
here,
ahead.
and then we
All
can
right,
come back to that, I promise. Denver, Colorado, good morning.
Yes,
Thanks for holding.
I agree absolutely with Mr. Houston. There's a difference between assessment and testing. And I think the type of testing that happened with Dr. Page and with the Bush administration in Texas, it actually just teach rote memory and testing, and teaching to the test is not teaching to assessment.
Well, there's a couple of issues, and I'd like to answer the caller's concern, because it's a big thing you often hear. Oh my gosh, how can we teach the test? Is that really doing us any good? The fact of the matter is, you talk to great educators and they say there's nothing wrong with teaching to a test when the test reflects what you want children to know. If you have a really clear set of goals, and that's what schools are about, getting children to school every day. I sent my 4 kids out today, and they all have certain things that they're going to be expected to know. The tests are intended in a long frame, not the ones that you take for chapter and review during the week that the teachers administer, but on a yearly basis, they're intended to take a snapshot and understand, assess what they know. But the reason it's a test is because there is a stake, and there should be a consequence, and children should know that it does count, and their hard work will be rewarded. What we have, and I have to say that I absolutely loved the statement when I heard President Bush first say that we have kind of a conspiracy of low expectations in this country, because we're saying to people, particularly minority children in urban areas, that we don't think you can achieve. We're not quite saying that, but we might as well be saying that when we say you can't get there. We don't want to put you in front of a test and stress you out. In fact, children can learn. All children can learn, and kids can be pressured in a good way. But I want to go back just for a second to the block grant issue, because I think this is really important. Block grants really are nothing more than saying we're going to give the money back to the states, the money that they sent to Washington, to let the governors and people elected there decide how best to do education. And there's a fundamental difference in philosophy here. Most of the school reform activists around the country believe they are better equipped, parents and teachers, to determine how best to educate their children than people who can dictate or create programs in Washington. And that's really what kind of the flexibility in a block grant is about.
Can I add one point on that? And that is our concern about block grants. And we like the, as I said, we like the flexibility provisions, but we're very concerned about the money going to the state level. Because federal money has historically been used to offset some of the inequities that we have built into the system, and that's one of the fundamental issues that we've not really confronted in this country, is the fact that we have a very inequitable system within states and between states. And unfortunately, states have not done a very good job of addressing that. One of the concerns we have is we're not sure if it goes to the state that the federal money will be used in a way that targets the money at the kids that have the greatest need, and that's our biggest concern.
Fruitport, Michigan, good morning.
Good morning. I think with the testing, I think it's fine, except I think it deprives children of a day-to-day learning, because schools then just concentrate on, we have to pass this test so we can get funding, we have to pass this, we have to pass that, and the kids go without. I just think they need to concentrate on adding teachers to the school. Our district is cutting teachers this year.
Thanks for the call. We heard from Jeanne Allen on teaching the test. Do you agree?
Yeah, I've had an interesting situation, because I've actually sort of been after my own membership, and since they pay my salary, that's a little bit dangerous. But I've had to try to keep reminding them that strictly creating a situation where they're raising their test scores absent that making any sense in the greater context of things may not be doing the best service to their children, and that obviously they want to improve achievement over time, but we also have to understand that what we're testing for is a fairly narrow slice of what we want kids to know. We have not figured out yet how to test for very important things, creativity, perseverance, collaborative behavior, honesty. There's a lot of things that we want kids to get as they grow up that we don't have an assessment for. We shouldn't lose those things as we look at what it is we can measure and go after those. So again, it's a balancing act, and I do think that in some cases, some schools and some school districts have put such an emphasis on raising their test scores that they've lost sight of the bigger picture, and that troubles me. And that's my own people I'm talking about. Those are the educational people in the business, and so there needs to be a constant balance between understanding we need to know how kids are doing, we need to know what we can measure, and look at that periodically so we have a sense of it. But there's a lot of other things that are more important.
Connolly, South Carolina, good morning.
Good morning. I would like to ask, what is our culture in the U.S. that is focusing on the development of high achievement? If we compare the United States to Asia, who's the highest scoring area in the world, we see a real difference. Why do we want children to do, or why do children rather, why do they want to do well in school? They want to do well because of the culture's values. Our values are so diluted in so many places. We have young people that they want to make $1 million a year and be an athlete. They want to be a Britney Spears or into Hollywood. Why do they have to score well to do those kinds of things? In Asia, it's much more focused on the responsibility of the family to bring up the children, to want to work hard and achieve well.
I have to say, I think this is a particularly key point in this debate. We do have somewhat of an anti-intellectual fervor going on here. I mean, we had standards being pushed under President Clinton for a long time. Now we're doing the next step, which is testing. It's a real big, bipartisan, very pro-child effort to bring about better schools, and yet so many of us parents are sitting back saying, oh my gosh, don't stress our kids out, or maybe we should worry a little bit more about, their free time, and those things are very important. But the Asian mentality, the mentality of the countries who are beating our pants off in these international assessments and leaving us at 19th and 20th, have something here. And what they do is they all agree that it's really important for their children to go to school and learn something. And I think, Paul, that hard work and perseverance and creativity are things that come from setting an expectation level. If you don't work really hard, you're not going to get ahead. But we're allowing kids to get A's and B's for doing very little. We're allowing them to pass standardized tests for doing nothing. You can graduate 12th grade by passing basic 8th and 10th grade tests in most communities around the country. That's something that we don't realize. And so I think the standards and testing debate and what we're trying to do in so many states today is trying to get at that problem.
I would just respond. I would agree with Jeanne if she would be willing to add another word, and that is meaningful. I think one of the problems that we have in school today is so much of the work is not terribly meaningful to the children, and we have to make schools places kids want to be. They have to be motivated and have a sense of engagement in what's going on, and that's something that I think is lacking in a lot of our schools, unfortunately. And just one thing in terms of the caller's point, and that's really the issue, that I think it is a lot about culture, and there is cultural differences between countries, and we have raised a generation of kids that seem to know the price of everything, the value of nothing, and that's a concern, and we have to look at our broader cultural values as we're looking at this whole picture as well, and we do in this country, I think, emphasize getting a job after school and playing sports and having, watching television. There's a lot of things that impinge upon our kids' attention. That's part of our cultural values. It may not be the best possible thing, but it is a part of who we are, and we have to deal with all those things while we're dealing with this.
Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Republican line. Good morning.
Good morning.
You're on the air. Please hit the mute.
I'm hitting my mute button right now if I can find it.
You got 2 seconds.
There it is. One of the things that I have never been able to figure out, or anybody figure out for me, I went to school during the Depression, and we had everything we needed and everything. And now these kids have to get out and sell candy bars and paper, wrapping paper and everything. And another thing I wanted to point out, too, is that parents, if I had a child in the first grade that couldn't read Run, Spot, Run, or whatever they're using these days, wouldn't it be up to the parent to go? We have very good involvement with parents here in Oak Ridge.
If the parents knew that their child couldn't read Run, Spot, Run, they should be there and they should be weighing in. Part of the problem is we have so little information as parents in this country today about what our children are supposed to know and what they're supposed to do. And quite frankly, parents overwhelmingly who call us in droves complain that when they ask questions, they're treated like, quote unquote, just a parent. They're told, oh, we know what we're doing, or oh, we'll get to that, or that's not the way we're teaching today. We had a parent call up the other day. It was told that, well, their child was going to learn the math skills they were talking about in the multiplication tables, but that was something that they really weren't focusing on a lot this year, and they could take the flashcards home if they wanted. I mean, this kind of stuff really does deter a parent and makes them think, well, gosh, if I'm not welcome, I'm kind of going to sit it out. So I think that is an issue. But the reason, quite frankly, that you had a lot of what you had in the Depression, and they complain that we don't today, is because we are expecting and we are demanding from Washington and state capitals and lobbying groups that schools do everything, that schools solve every problem. And quite frankly, that's why we have kids who can't read and write, but their self-esteem is great because we worry about how they feel all day long. And yet they can't do reading and writing. And so we have to get back to where we realize school is for academics. And we need to pressure back to society and back to the parents to realize they got to pick up the rest of the slack along the way.
Email from California. I'm a California teacher. The current emphasis on testing is very destructive here. Test preparation takes place all year, and that activity often replaces meaningful teaching. Misapplication of the standards movement forces us to teach many students skills and concepts they are not developmentally ready to master.
And one of the things that worries me about the testing, particularly the high stakes part of the testing situation, is that I think Jeanne and I would agree that the whole issue of setting standards is the right move. It was the right move for education in this country. I see the potential backlash against this where it's too narrow or where it's not delivering the kind of information that actually is useful and it's deterring people from doing their work. I've really pushed back not just against the testing, but the whole thing that goes with the testing. And I think that the standards movement itself could well be negatively affected. And I think we have a long history in this country of swinging from one side of the pendulum to the other in educational issues. We go from one extreme, then we go to the other extreme, then we go back and forth. I think what we need to do is find a middle here, and I think that we're going to have to work through these issues in a way that makes sense to everybody so that we can stay towards the middle of things and not swing back and forth, because we may end up undoing the last 10 years if we're not careful, just because of some things that may be wrong in the system.
Great Lakes, Illinois, good morning.
Good morning. I'm in the United States Navy, and I'm an African American. And I'm calling to say that while standardized testing itself doesn't seem to be so much of a problem as giving a test, but the problem to me seems to be the starting point of the students that are going to be tested. There's going to be one standardized test. There should be one standardized starting point. And what we'll probably see is that the schools that have less equipment, less textbooks with pages missing out, basically inner city schools, poor schools, are going to do worse on the test.
Well, I want to make a couple of comments. First of all, it's very important where we start out, and resources are very important. But again, the quality, not the quantity, is the big issue here. We have textbooks in this country that deserve to have pages falling out because between the 500 pages, there's not a lot of content there. And part of setting the standard and setting a test in place and helping children to achieve is forcing school districts to buy books that reflect the standards. The teacher in California, I don't think really is focusing on the real picture and the big picture about why California has standards. They have some of the best standards in the country now. They've gone through it over the last couple of years. And it's forcing school districts to buy books that they never would have bought before that have more content to help their children. It's a stress on teachers. They haven't been used to having to prep kids for tests. At the same time, she needs to look at the standards and realize that when the standard says we expect kids in the 4th grade to be exploring the contributions of Native Americans in the West, there's going to be questions on the test about that. You look at that as an opportunity to teach the kids. So these aren't idle questions that don't have content. The questions on these tests are designed to pull out information and to help kids learn.
I have 2 points I'd make. One is having served as superintendent in a district that had a lot of resources, and then going immediately from that district to a district that had much fewer resources per child. The caller's point's well taken, because those kids in that second district have every right, and we should as a country have every expectation that those children be able to rise to that same level that the more affluent and the more advantaged kids have. But without the adequate resources putting it in to get them ready for that, it's going to be a problem. The second point in terms of the testing, one of the concerns we have about the testing is because it is going to have a financial impact on districts. Wealthy districts are going to be able to handle that financial impact. We calculate it'll be about 0.3% of their budget to handle the testing. In poor districts, it's going to be about 3% of their budget to do exactly the same thing because they have smaller budgets. And so and yet they're all doing the same kind of testing. So that's some of the issues that we think are sort of embedded in this current budget that need to be looked at. And it's not that we're not at all against testing. I'm going to make it very clear here that we think that a comprehensive assessment system is appropriate, but it needs to be fine-tuned and needs to be worked at. And hopefully the Congress, as they work through this bill over the next few weeks, will do some of this fine-tuning and put in some of the same standards for the testing part of the program that they're putting in for the interventions part, where they're saying it should be peer-reviewed, it should have high quality. We think that just pulling a test off the shelf and saying that meets the thing may not be the way to do it.
Brandon, Florida, good morning.
Good morning.
You're on the air.
All right. Is it Mrs. Allen?
It is.
All right. Mrs. Allen, I believe you must have the ear of the president. And is that correct? Does he rely on your counsel?
No, we're a separate, independent, nonprofit group.
All right. Well, probably he does listen to you about this testing. I'm a retired teacher, almost 40 years. And, of course, that doesn't qualify me for anything. But I'm also a mother and a grandmother of lots of children.
That qualifies you for a lot.
What?
That qualifies you for a lot.
Well, that doesn't mean that I know anything. But anyway, I have noticed through my years of teaching and in volunteering in an elementary school here in Brandon, the same thing goes on and on and on, despite of all the talk about what to do about schools. Now, a third of the children in this school, and it's in a pretty good neighborhood, need one-on-one instruction. I know that's economically impractical, but it's also economically impractical just to discard these children. Now, believe me, with President Bush's talk about leaving no child behind, there are going to be children left behind. I'm working with 6 of them right now.
Caller, what do you think about annual testing as proposed by President Bush?
You know, if these were cans of vegetable soup, where the products are the same and the environment is the same, I think we ought to test. But where the environment of these children is so different, and I'm talking about children who don't have parents, they live with foster parents. I taught a boy last year who was homeless. Things are not the same. Some of them come to school with a good breakfast. Some of them come to school without any breakfast.
Then, caller, how do you propose that one would measure progress, if not testing?
Well, testing, I've never taught a year that I didn't test and retest to find out where my children were. Most teachers test. They want to know where their children are, unless they're just sitting up there warming the seat.
Appreciate the call.
I'd just add one thing. I think I'll give you a cheap way to assess whether your child's in a good situation or not for learning. Walk in a classroom and see which way the kids in the class are leaning. If they're leaning forward, you've probably got a pretty good classroom there where the kids are engaged and the learning's impacting them. If they're sort of back on their heels and uninvolved, then there probably needs to be work in that classroom. That's a very overly simplistic approach, but actually I think it has some merit. The point being that there's a lot of different ways to see how well kids are doing. Teacher evaluation is part of it. External assessment, which is what we're talking about, is part of it.
And approaches can vary. Approaches should vary, absolutely. We shouldn't be standardizing our schools. In fact, our organization supports the concept of charter schools precisely because we think diversity in the classroom and how children learn is very important. But the caller's point, I just have to make sure that we emphasize this. Everybody is very concerned about the children who are left behind. One of the reasons we're having this huge, high-pitched battle right now is because we have such awful achievement, particularly among latchkey kids, minority kids, urban children, okay? However, we know success with minority kids. We know how to achieve. And we've got a Secretary of Education right now, for example, as we have before, who had a district with children who come from unheard of poverty levels for most Americans. And he was able to put those children into schools and get them to achieve with high expectations, with a school of hard knocks, and at the same time by involving parents in the information stream. The same is going on in schools in New York City and Washington, D.C. and elsewhere around the country. The point being, if you allow schools to do what they need to do to thrive, but you fix a package, an accountability package that says you need to get here and hold them accountable, they're going to achieve with the worst off kids.
Boca Raton, good morning.
Good morning. I'm calling from Boca Raton, Florida, and Florida is a state that requires testing. And the strange thing that I find is that the tests are only given in public schools. Private schools do not have to give assessments.
Is that correct?
That's generally correct. I think a lot of private schools do their own assessments. They're not required, and of course the difference is they currently have not been receiving government money, so therefore they don't have to live on the same requirements. And one of the interesting dilemmas that I think the school choice issue will face as it goes forward, that debate goes forward. Jeanne and I are very different sides on this subject, but I think one of the interesting problems for the private schools is going to be if they start receiving government money, will in fact they need and should the public then expect that they meet some of the same criteria in terms of requirements that public schools have met. And I think that might, one of the nice things about private schools is they're private, and the nice things about public schools is they're public, and they are there for different purposes. And when you start mixing those purposes, you may end up with some unintended consequences that would be harmful.
Newburyport, Massachusetts, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good.
I have several things, and I'm going to try to go through very quickly. Just a brief on my background. I am a private school teacher. I've taught in sectarian and non-sectarian circumstances for a number of years. I have a master's degree. I've taught 6th grade up through 12th grade. And I just want to take quick issue with what the point was on private schools. If you were to allow poor inner city kids to have a chance at a Catholic school education, for example, the money that would travel with them from President Bush's proposal would be much less than those schools are currently spending in real dollar terms per child. So therefore, the public school would actually have more money and not have to foot the bill to educate that child. Also, I had several special needs kids in my classrooms, but I had and it wasn't a matter of class size for me. I had, in general, 25 kids to a classroom. It's a matter of the commitment to teaching and the commitment to the basics. This argument of you can't teach to the test, I find completely erroneous. If the curriculum is so watered down that the kids are learning self-esteem, but they're trying to make them into box without having to learn how to play the scales on the piano, then it's completely, I don't want to put it, it's silly.
Well, I couldn't agree more on a number of fronts. First of all, private schools do test. They have to test. They have parents who are consumers who have to buy their product, and the only way you know whether or not to send your child to a school is if you look at the data. And this is what we were talking about, data. We have lots of data voluntarily done in the private sector, not as much in the public sector, although increasingly, because of the pressure of standards, public school districts are taking it on their own to publish data, to go to the web, to even advertise. Secondly, in terms of the commitment of teachers and the special needs kids and going to private schools, I mean, there's absolutely no question that we can no longer do education as a one-size-fits-all system. It shouldn't matter whether or not it's a public, private, as long as the school works and is willing to educate the child and is willing to be held accountable.
Thousand Oaks, California, good morning.
Hi, my name is Jeff Pritchard. I'm 19, and having just been a student at high school, I have to agree with Mrs. Allen on the point that we have to make schools more academically centered. And for me, I know that when I got into junior college, even that it was the expectations of a college as opposed to a high school were so much more demanding and overwhelming, and I really didn't feel that the school system prepared me as far as study habits and discipline goes. And I think that's a good thing that testing puts in for we definitely need more testing for making our schools more academically centered.
Appreciate the call. Elkhorn, Wisconsin, good morning.
Hi, I'd like to make a couple of comments in reference to the public school, private school situation and testing overall. My daughter, I have her in private school primarily because of the overall performance of the private school. They do implement strict testing, and 50% of the students that graduate from that school and go into the high school graduate as honor roll students. I think we're putting too much emphasis on the testing issue as a whole, and we're failing to meet the needs of the students. I suffer from dyslexia. That was failed to be noticed when I went through school, and when I finally was able to make it into college, that problem was met, and I went on to become an A student. But it was because that need was met through testing and whatnot, and I don't think the needs of the students are being met at all.
Well, I think, first of all, we have to realize that we're not also talking about testing kids every year and then holding them there where they are. The testing idea, which we are probably making too big of a deal about because it's only one part of the President's package and it's only one part of what we're doing in education reform across the country. But if you just take that example, if you had been tested in first grade and they determined from the test that you couldn't do your letters and writing well and perhaps there was a root cause being dyslexia, that would have been used as a starting point for what to do next. Over the course of 3 years, if they looked at all the kids who had been tested and realized that there had been no progress between first and third grade, then we know we have a school problem. So we can use measurements to figure out what to do with the child, what to do with the group of children, what to do with the school. In Detroit, we have schools that have been shut down because they were bad. And the only reason we knew they were bad is because there's a Michigan test that year after year was doing benchmark testing and finding out that even a child who was, say, at a lower level of reading didn't make any progress in 2 years. Now, even a child at a lower level reading should make progress. So we should be making progress year to year. We can't expect everyone to be reading better than everyone else, but we can indeed expect them to be making progress. And if our schools aren't doing that, then we do have to shine some sun on it and let people know that there's a way out.
I think that I don't fundamentally disagree with Jeanne on that point. I think that the problem that we have is that in many cases the testing we're using is not measuring the value add that we want to get at, which is what her point is. Are the schools making a difference? We need to use assessments that actually measure that. We also need to get the stuff back to schools in a timely manner so they can use the data and use it more for diagnostic purposes. The gentleman caller was talking about that, they didn't pick up on the fact he had a specific learning problem. Well, a generalized test was not going to generate that except to say he's not doing well, which probably he and his parents probably already knew that. So the question is why. Another point that has not been made yet, and there are provisions in the new plan which we applaud, which is to disaggregate the data by race and social class and what have you, so that you get at, because sometimes a school will look very good based upon their testing results, but if you pull the data apart, you realize that certain kids in that school are not being well served. And so moving and getting more information and then using that information is very appropriate. I think our concern, and it was really related to some of the earlier callers, is that new TV show that's on that's controversial now, The Weakest Link. I mean, I don't think we want to create a testing system that sort of makes some of our kids the weakest link and they sort of get voted out of the panel based upon their not being able to answer certain questions. So I think we have to look at this in a reasonable way, in a comprehensive way, look at all these issues, and a lot of, again, Jeanne and I agree on a lot of these issues of where we ought to be going, and how do we design a system that gets us where we need to get to.
Senate debate on the education bill begins tomorrow. What will you be watching for?
Well, we're going to be watching, obviously, this provision. We'll obviously be looking at the funding levels and that sort of thing. We're also very interested in some other areas we haven't talked about this morning, the special ed provisions and whether they're going to be providing adequate resources there. The portability question and where that goes in terms of the choice issues. So there's a lot in this package. A lot of it's very good, a lot of stuff that we're very supportive of. Some of it we think could be fine-tuned and made better. And so we'll be looking at all that and trying to weigh in on that, and I'm sure Jeanne's organization will as well.
According to the Bush budget, $7.3 billion for the special education grants to states, an increase of $1 billion or 15.8%. Are you happy with that?
No. It sounds like a lot, but the federal government set as a goal 40% of the cost of special ed when they put the provisions in the special ed back in the 70s. And what that did was it was never funded, so it's impacted adversely the local school systems because they've had to take money from the general ed budget basically to meet the federal requirements. And there's nothing wrong with serving those children. Everyone, I think, applauds the fact that schools are doing a better job now serving those particular children. But unfortunately, in many cases, it's being done at the expense of other children. And if the federal government had met its obligation and funded what they told the schools they had to do, we would have been better off. So we think it needs to be much higher than what they're providing. It's a step in the right direction, but they're still a long way from what they've created for their own obligation to themselves.
Tomorrow the Senate debate begins. What are you going to be watching for, and who are some of the main players?
We want to make sure that the accountability provisions stay intact. In other words, if states get money, if local school districts get money, that they in fact have to prove results and that they're on a tight time frame to do so. We want to make sure the charter school support facilities financing stays intact. We want to make sure that the Senator Carper, Senator Gregg amendment, which would empower school districts and parents to make some other choices among public schools, in fact, gets passed. That's an amendment to the bill that's going to be happening tomorrow. And those two are key players, Democratic side and Republican side, Carper and Gregg.
Jeanne Allen is with the Center for Education Reform. Paul Houston is with the Association of School Administrators. Thank you both for joining us this morning. Just a few minutes, we'll be back with Gail Shearer of Consumers Union to talk about prescription drug prices. We'll be right back.